Winter came to Ashfield the way a creditor comes to a door already ashamed of itself. Patient, certain, unhurried, because it knew it would be let in eventually, and it saw no reason to knock twice. It arrived first as a thinning of the light, then as a hardening of the mud on the lane, then as frost lacing the hedgerows like lace on a gown too fine for the woman wearing it, and by the second week of December, it had settled over the valley entire. A grey weight pressing the smoke flat against the chimneys, and the birds silent in the black branches. The manor at Ravensmoor Hall stood at the top of the rise the way it always had. Pale stone gone the colour of old bone in the fogged light. Its windows dark on the west wing, where no one had lit a fire in 3 years. And if a house could hold its breath the way a mourner holds hers at the graveside, Ravensmoor Hall was holding it still. Had been holding it since the telegram came. Since the black bunting went up over the door and was never quite taken down, only faded, until it hung the grey of everything else. Below the rise, past the frozen mill pond and the lane that no longer saw much traffic, there was a smaller holding called Thistle Cross, a tenant farm with a stable that leaned a little more to the east each winter. And it was here, in the hour before dawn, that Wren Ashkin did the work that kept her family from the workhouse. And did it, as she did everything, without complaint and without an audience. She was 22, and had been the one to muck the stalls and mend the harness, and carry the water since her father's hands had gone too stiff with the joint ill to manage more than a slow shuffle from the hearth to the window and back. And her mother had been 3 years in the churchyard herself, so that the work of the farm had settled onto Wren's shoulders, the way frost settles onto a roof, silently, completely, and without anyone asking whether the roof could bear it. She wore, always, a cloak of undyed grey wool that had been her mother's, patched twice at the hem and once at the shoulder, and it was so plain, so entirely without ornament, that the women of the village had long ago stopped noticing her in it at all, the way one stops noticing a gatepost one passes every day. And Wren had made a kind of peace with this, had decided, somewhere in the slow accumulation of years, that being unseen was simply the shape of her life, not a wound to be nursed, but a fact to be managed, like the leaning stable or the debt her father would not speak of. She did not think herself unhappy. She would have been surprised, even faintly offended, to hear anyone suggest it. She rose before light, and she worked until past dark, and she took a plain satisfaction in the doing of a thing well, in a stall mucked clean, in a horse's coat brushed to a shine nobody but the horse would ever appreciate, in bread that rose properly despite the cold larder. And if there was, underneath all this competence, a small persistent ache that had no name and asked for nothing, she had learned to set it aside, the way she set aside a stone found in the flour, without fuss, without comment, simply removed and forgotten. The village of Ashfield had its own economy of attention, and Wren understood precisely where she stood within it, below the miller's daughters with their ribboned bonnets, below the vicar's niece, newly arrived from town, below anyone at all who had a father able to walk unaided, or a dowry able to speak for her. And this understanding did not embitter her so much as clarify things, the way a cold morning clarifies the outline of the hills. She had long since stopped attending the assemblies at the village hall, not from any wounded pride, but from simple arithmetic, there being no gown to wear that would not announce her circumstances louder than any word could. And she had found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not mind the staying home nearly so much as she was meant to. There was the fire to bank, after all, and her father's chest to rub with liniment against the damp, and the account book to balance by a single candle, the numbers in it thin and getting thinner, the rent to Ravensmoor's steward due at Lady Day, and no clear sense yet of how it would be met, since the new master of the house, or the man who called himself so, had raised it twice already this year on holdings up and down the valley, out of some notion, folk said, of restoring a name that had gone quiet and grey, along with everything else since the young Duke had died at Vittoria, and been buried, they said, under a monument so grand it looked less like grief than like an apology, or perhaps a down payment. Wren had not known the Duke, not properly, had seen him perhaps twice in her life, once as a boy on a black pony cutting across the mill pond field with the careless ease of someone who had never once in his life wondered where his next meal was coming from, and once at his father's funeral, standing very straight and very pale in the churchyard, while the whole village watched him and pretended not to. She had felt, even then, a strange fellow feeling for him, watched from a distance and appraised from a distance, both of them made into a kind of public property by circumstances neither had chosen, though his circumstances had at least come wrapped in silk, and hers had come wrapped in wool gone thin at the elbows. She thought of him sometimes, not often, mostly when she passed the great stone monument the new master had commissioned at the crossroads, a soldier in marble, with his sword reversed and his head bowed, the dates carved beneath him final and absolute. And she thought, without any particular sentiment, only a kind of weary recognition, that it must be a strange thing to be buried so thoroughly and so publicly, to have your absence made into architecture. She did not know, on that particular night, that the stable's east door had a gap in its boards wide enough for the wind, and wide enough, too, for something else to come through it before morning, something that would not care in the slightest whether she was seen or unseen, whether her cloak was grey or gold, and that would, before the year was out, undo every quiet arithmetic by which she had learned to measure her own worth. The farmhouse itself seemed to sense nothing of what was coming, settling into its usual winter hush, the fire banked low, her father's breathing slow and even in the chair by the hearth, where he had fallen asleep again over his mending, a habit she had stopped correcting months ago, because waking him only reminded them both of what his hands could no longer manage. She had banked the fire, checked the shutters twice against the coming storm, and carried her lamp out across the yard toward the stable, with the particular unthinking economy of a woman who had walked that same path so many hundreds of times she could have made it blind, counting the fence posts by feel, the third one loose since autumn, and still unmended for want of a spare hour, the fourth one leaning the way the whole farm seemed to lean these days, patient and tired, and waiting for a hand that had time to set it right. She thought, crossing the yard, of the rent due at Lady Day, of the new master's reputation for hardness, of 100 small worries that had become so familiar they no longer even troubled her sleep, only sat with her the way an old dog sits with its owner, present and unremarkable. And she thought, too, with a faint, private wryness she allowed no one to see, that a woman with her particular collection of burdens had very little room left over for surprises, that life had, by 22, taught her most of what it intended to teach, and that whatever tomorrow brought would likely be more of the same, patient, grey, manageable weight. She could not have said, crossing that yard with her lamp throwing its small circle of gold against the sleet, that she was wrong to think so, only that she was, in this one particular instance, about to be proven so thoroughly and so suddenly mistaken that the whole shape of her careful, quiet arithmetic would need to be redrawn from its very first line. The lamp in her hand threw its small gold circle across the frozen ruts of the yard, and somewhere beyond the reach of that light, the wind was already carrying something toward her that no amount of careful housekeeping could have prepared her to receive. A thing that did not care one whit for rent ledgers, or invisible grey cloaks, or any of the quiet arrangements by which a plain, overlooked woman kept her small world upright against a large, indifferent one. It was the horses that told her first, a restlessness moving through the stalls like a current under still water, the old cob stamping and blowing, and the mare pressed flat against the far wall with her ears pinned. And Wren, who had slept lightly all her life, the way people do who are the only ones listening for trouble, came down the ladder from the loft with her lamp already lit before she had properly finished waking. The wind had picked up in the night, driving sleet sideways under the eaves, and she thought at first it was only that, only the storm working its usual mischief on animals too foolish to know weather from wolves, until she rounded the end stall and saw, in the thin circle of lamplight, a shape on the straw that was not straw and was not shadow. A man lay half in the doorway and half out of it, as though the last of his strength had failed him at the very threshold. One arm flung out into the yard, where the sleet had already begun to crust it white. And for one long, frozen second, Wren did not move at all, held by the particular stillness that comes before the mind permits itself to believe what the eyes have already reported. Then she was on her knees in the filthy straw, with no thought at all for her skirts, her lamp set down hard enough to gutter, her hands finding the pulse at his throat before she had even decided to look for it. And it was there, thin and quick and far too fast, a bird's pulse in a man's throat. And she let out a breath she had not known she was holding. He was dressed, or had been dressed, in the remains of a uniform coat so torn and stained she could make out little of its original color, beyond a suggestion of blue gone black with old blood. And there was a wound low on his side that had been bandaged once, badly, with a strip of shirt linen now soaked through, and a fever on him so fierce she could feel the heat of it through his coat before her hand ever touched his brow. His face, what she could see of it under 3 days of beard and the grime of a long, hard road, was gaunt in the particular way of a man who has not eaten properly in some time. But it was not an unhandsome face. The bones of it good, the mouth set even in unconsciousness, in a hard, controlled line, as though even fever could not quite persuade him to relax into softness. And there was a scar through one eyebrow that had not come from this fall. She did not waste time wondering who he was, or how he had come to be dying in her stable in the middle of a sleet storm. She had learned long ago that such questions were luxuries afforded to people with time to spare, and she had none. She dragged him, with a strength that surprised her own arms, into the driest corner of the stable, where the old cart-horse blankets were stacked, and she stripped away the ruined bandage and looked at the wound beneath it. A deep gash gone the ugly red-black of infection at its edges. And she knew, with the flat certainty of someone who had nursed a dying mother and a crippled father and half the livestock in the parish, that this man would be dead by morning if the fever were not brought down and the wound not cleaned properly. And that there was no one to send for, not at this hour, not in this weather, not for a stranger who might, for all she knew, be a deserter or a thief, or worse. She thought of Ravensmoor Hall on the rise above, where a physician could certainly be summoned, if one had the standing to summon him, and she thought, too, of what the new steward would make of a tenant girl found tending a strange soldier alone in her stable at 3 a.m. And she decided, in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, that whatever this man was, he was first and simplest a person in pain, and that the arithmetic of reputation could wait until he was not actively dying. She built up the small stove she kept for the horse's mash until it threw real heat, and she set water to boil, and she went to the house only long enough to snatch clean linen and the willow bark and yarrow she kept for her father's fevers, moving through her own kitchen like a thief in it, careful not to wake him, careful not to have to explain a thing she did not yet understand herself. When she came back, the man had not stirred, but his breathing had gone shallower, and something in her chest tightened at the sound of it. A tightening she did not examine too closely, and she knelt again in the straw and began, with hands gone steady from long practice, to do the only thing she knew how to do for anyone, which was to work. She cleaned the wound as gently as its ugliness would permit, and bound it with clean linen, and forced a little willow bark tea between his cracked lips, a spoonful at a time, holding his jaw with one hand the way she might have held a foal's. And all the while, the storm went on outside, and the horses settled by slow degrees, as though satisfied that the trouble had been taken in hand. And Wren Ashcombe sat back on her heels in the lamplight, and looked at the stranger's ruined coat and his soldier's scars, and thought, with a small, unwelcome flare of feeling she could not name, that whoever he was, he had clearly been someone's, once, to somebody, and that it seemed a hard thing that he should die alone in a stranger's straw, with no one in the world the wiser. She sat with him through what remained of that first night, feeding the little stove log by log, watching the fever take him and release him in slow, uneven waves. And more than once she thought she had lost the argument entirely, his breath catching and stalling in a way that made her own chest go tight with a dread she had no right to feel, over a man whose name she did not even know. She talked to him, in the low hours before dawn, the way she sometimes talked to the horses when the work was hard and the night was long, not expecting any answer, only needing the sound of a voice in the dark to keep her own courage steady. Telling him, in fragments, about the farm and her father and the leaning fence post she had not yet found time to mend. And if some part of her suspected the words mattered less than the simple fact of being spoken, she did not examine that suspicion too closely, only kept talking, kept working the cold from his hands with her own, kept forcing the willow bark tea between his lips, a spoonful at a time, until the sky beyond the stable door had gone from black to the deep, bruised blue that comes just before first light. By the time the cocks in the yard began their ragged chorus, the worst of the fever seemed, marginally, to have broken. His breathing gone a fraction steadier, his colour a fraction less like ash, and Wren sat back at last, against the rough boards of the stall, her hands raw and her eyes burning with exhaustion, and allowed herself, for one unguarded moment, to simply look at the stranger she had spent the night keeping alive, at the hard, clean lines of a face that even illness could not entirely soften, and to wonder, with a curiosity she could not quite suppress, no matter how firmly she tried, what manner of life had left a man so plainly accustomed to command, lying half dead and utterly friendless in her family's stable straw. He did not die by morning, though for 2 days it seemed a close and uncertain thing, the fever breaking and returning like a tide that could not decide whether to go out, and Wren nursed him through both days in the stable, telling her father only that a traveller's horse had gone lame, and she was minding the beast until its owner could be sent for. A lie so thin she was ashamed of it even as she spoke it. But her father's eyes these days rarely left the fire long enough to question much of anything, and the lie held. On the third morning, the stranger woke fully for the first time, and Wren, who had dozed at last with her back against the stall wall, came awake to find him watching her, with eyes gone clear and sharp, despite the hollows beneath them. A pale grey that seemed to take her in whole in a single unhurried pass. Her cloak, her chapped hands, the state of the straw, the careful bandage at his side. And something in that look made her feel, oddly, as though she were the one being assessed for usefulness, rather than the other way round. He did not thank her first, he asked, in a voice roughened from disuse, but carrying still an unmistakable authority, an accent schooled somewhere far from Ashfield, where he was, and how long, and who else knew. And Wren answered each question plainly, because she had never learned the trick of answering a direct question with anything but a direct answer. And when she had finished, he was silent a long moment, his jaw working. And then he said, with a kind of grim precision, that no one else must know, not yet, not for a good while, and that he would need to remain hidden, and would need her help to do it, and that he understood he had no right whatsoever to ask such a thing of a stranger, who owed him nothing. She might have asked why. Any sensible woman would have asked why, would have demanded to know what manner of trouble followed a half-dead soldier into a tenant's stable that required such secrecy. But Wren found herself, instead, doing what she always did when faced with a practical problem, which was to consider what it would cost her to say yes, and what it would cost her to say no. And the arithmetic came out, as it usually did, in favor of the person in front of her who needed help, rather than the abstraction of consequences that might or might not arrive later. She told him she could keep him hidden in the loft above the stable, that her father rarely left the house, and the farmhand who came twice a week could be managed, that she could bring food without remark, since she cooked for the household regardless, but that he would have to understand she had a farm to run and a father to nurse, and could not devote herself entirely to his convalescence, and that in exchange for her silence and her care, she would want honest labor from him the moment he was fit for it, because a farm did not run on charity, and she was not in the business of keeping secrets for free. It was, she was aware even as she said it, an absurd sort of bargain to strike with a man found half dead in a doorway, and she saw something flicker across his face at the bluntness of it. Not offense, she thought, but something closer to surprise, as though he had expected either gratitude too effusive to be useful, or suspicion too fearful to be borne, and had gotten instead a woman negotiating terms as though he were a hired hand, rather than a mystery. He agreed. He gave her a name, or a name he was willing to give. Thorn. No more than that. Offered flatly and without elaboration, and she did not press for more, telling herself it was none of her concern, and telling herself too, in some quieter corner of her mind, that a man in hiding was entitled to keep what he needed to keep. In the days that followed, the shape of the arrangement settled itself without much further discussion, the way arrangements do between two people too practical to waste words on ceremony. She brought him food and clean linen, and whatever news of the district she gathered on her rounds, and he, as his strength returned by slow and grudging degrees, began to make himself useful in the small ways available to a man who could not yet be seen. Mending harness in the dim loft light, working oil into leather gone stiff with neglect, and, later, when he could stand without the wall's help, taking on the heavier work after dark when the yard was safely empty, so that Wren found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, waking to chores already half done, and she did not know what to make of the strange lightness this produced in her chest. A lightness she was careful not to examine too closely, filing it away instead with all the other feelings she had long ago learned to set aside without comment. Like a stone found in the flour, simply removed and forgotten, or so she told herself, though the stone, this time, seemed disinclined to stay forgotten for long. There was, in those early weeks of the arrangement, a particular comfort Wren had not expected to find in the sheer practicality of it, in the way a bargain, plainly struck and plainly kept, left no room for the sort of uncertainty that plagued softer, less honest dealings between people. She knew what Thorn owed her, and what she owed him, and the clarity of that knowledge was, she came to realize, its own kind of peace. A peace she had not known she was missing until she felt it settle over the strange new rhythm of her days, rising before light to see to her father and the visible chores, and rising again after dark to see to the hidden ones, the two halves of her life running alongside each other like parallel furrows, never touching, each one demanding its own separate competence. She told herself often in those weeks that she felt nothing beyond the ordinary satisfaction of a bargain well kept, that the lightness in her chest when she climbed the loft ladder each evening was no more than the lightness of a farm finally getting the help it had needed for years. And she nearly believed it, most days, because believing it required only the same discipline she applied to every other inconvenient feeling she had ever set aside. And she was, by long practice, very good at that particular discipline indeed. The summons came on a grey Tuesday, in the shape of a folded note, carried down from the hall by a footman who did not dismount. A note informing Wren Ashcombe that the matter of the Thistle Cross rent, now considerably in arrears, required her personal attendance upon the steward at 2 o'clock, and that failure to appear would be regarded as an admission of inability to meet the obligation, with whatever consequences the new master of Ravensmoor deemed appropriate. She had known this reckoning was coming, had watched it approach the way one watches weather gather on the far hills, and still the note landed in her stomach like a dropped stone, because there was no world in which she could produce what was owed, not with the roof wanting mending, and the physician's bill for her father still unpaid from the autumn. And she walked up the long drive that afternoon with her chin level and her grey cloak drawn close, telling herself she had faced worse than a steward's ledger, and would face worse again. Ravensmoor Hall, from the outside, had always seemed to her a kind of grand absence, and from the inside it seemed more so. The entrance hall vast and cold, despite a fire built up high enough to warm a room half its size. Portraits of Voss ancestors ranged along the walls in gilt frames gone slightly dull, and everywhere the particular hush of a house with too much space and too little life moving through it. She was made to wait a full quarter hour in an anteroom before being shown into the steward's office, and it was there, crossing the hall, that she caught her first proper sight of the man who now governed all their fates. Edmund Voss, cousin and heir presumptive to the late Duke, standing near the great staircase in conversation with a woman so beautifully dressed that Wren felt her own grey wool announce itself in the silence, the way a struck bell announces itself in an empty church. The woman was Lady Cressida Farrow, though Wren did not yet know the name. Dark-haired and lovely in the deliberate, curated way of someone who had spent a great deal of careful effort making loveliness look effortless. And she glanced at Wren for exactly as long as it took to catalogue and dismiss her. A glance so brief and so complete in its indifference that it somehow communicated more contempt than a lingering stare could have managed. Edmund Voss himself was a different matter. Tall and composed and handsome in a hard, glossy way, his eyes moving over Wren with a cold, assessing thoroughness that made her think, uncomfortably, of a man totaling figures in a ledger. And when he spoke to her at last, in the steward's office, it was with a courtesy so exact and so entirely without warmth that it functioned as its own species of insult. He informed her that the estate could no longer carry tenants who did not meet their obligations, that he was restoring Ravensmoor to a dignity it had lost in recent years, and that dignity required, among other things, solvency, and that she would be given until Lady Day to produce what was owed, or vacate Thistle Cross entirely, her father's infirmity notwithstanding. Wren sat through this with her hands folded in her lap and her spine very straight, and something in her, some old, stubborn thing that refused to be shamed simply because a room was cold and a man was rich, made her ask, quite steadily, whether the estate's dignity was better served by a full ledger or by tenants left in the road. And Edmund Voss looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not entirely read, something between irritation and a grudging, unwilling curiosity, before informing her that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford on behalf of a house still recovering from the loss of its true master, and that he would thank her not to lecture him on dignity when her own accounts spoke for themselves. She left the hall with her chin still level, though her hands, she noticed, did not stop shaking until she had passed the mill pond, and she walked home turning over what she had seen. The cold vastness of the house, the beautiful, indifferent woman, the hard, bright ambition in Edmund Voss's eyes, and she thought, with a shiver that had nothing to do with the wind, of the man hidden in her loft, with his soldier's scars and his flat refusal to explain himself, and wondered, for the first time with real unease, what manner of trouble could possibly connect a dying stranger in a stable to a house so entirely given over to counting what it had left. She passed the Crossroads monument on her way home, as she always did, and stopped before it this time, rather than walking on, studying the marble soldier's bowed head and reversed sword with an attention she had never before given it, reading again the dates carved beneath, so final, so absolute, so entirely unlike the uncertain, breathing weight of the man she had left sleeping in her loft not 4 hours before. She thought of Edmund Voss's cold, assessing eyes, of the ease with which she had settled into a dead man's house and a dead man's dignity, and she thought, with a small, unpleasant chill she could not quite place, of how very convenient it must be for a man like that to have his cousin safely buried under so much fine stone, and how very inconvenient, by the same measure, it might prove for anyone who discovered that the stone marked an error, rather than a fact. She did not yet dare to complete the thought, standing there in the gathering dusk, with the wind picking at her cloak. But some part of her, the same part that had knelt without question in the straw 3 months before, had already begun, quietly and without her full permission, to draw the two halves of her strange new life together into a single, dangerous shape. Winter did not relent, but something in the stable had begun, almost imperceptibly, to change. The way a room changes when a fire that has been laid all day is finally lit. No single moment marking the difference, and yet the difference undeniable. Thorn, as she still called him, grew stronger through the dark heart of January. The fever long gone, and the wound healed to a puckered scar he never spoke of. And with strength came a restlessness he channeled, to Wren's quiet astonishment, entirely into labour, as though work were the only language he trusted himself to speak fluently. He mended the leaning east wall of the stable with a competence that surprised her, setting the old beams true with a patience she would not have expected from a man who carried himself, even in convalescence, with the coiled stillness of someone accustomed to command rather than to compliance. And he did it at night, always at night, emerging from the loft only after the last light in the farmhouse had gone out, working by lantern in a silence Wren came to recognize as its own kind of conversation. She began to notice small things about him that a stranger would not have troubled to notice. The way he favored his left side still on cold mornings. The way his hands, when they were not working, had a stillness to them that looked almost deliberate, as though stillness itself had to be maintained by effort. The way he never once complained of the cold, or the cramped loft, or the plainness of the food she brought him, accepting all of it with a courtesy so exact it seemed, at first, like coldness, until she understood it was something else entirely. A kind of careful gratitude that did not know how to make itself larger or louder than it was. He was, she came to see, a man entirely unpracticed in the ordinary give and take of gratitude, as though he had spent so long being served that being helped, plainly and without flourish, by someone who expected nothing grand in return, was a foreign country, whose customs he was learning slowly and with visible effort. Their conversations, when they came sideways, over the mending of a bridle or the mixing of a mash, and were sparse at first, a question about the farm, an observation about the weather. But they lengthened by degrees as January wore on, and Wren found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she looked forward to the hour after her father was settled for the night, when she could climb to the loft with a plate of bread and cheese and find Thorn waiting in the lamplight, with that same clear, assessing look, though it had softened, she thought, into something less like appraisal and more like simple attention. The attention of a man who had decided a person was worth the trouble of listening to. She told him, one such evening, about her mother, about the fever that had taken her 3 winters past, and about her father's hands, gone useless with the joint ill. And she told it plainly, without asking for pity, because she had never learned to ask for pity, and would not have known what to do with it if offered. And Thorn listened, with a stillness so complete, she thought at first he had not heard her, until he said, quietly, that a house run by one pair of capable hands was rarer and harder won than most people understood, and that he had seen grand estates fall to ruin under masters with every advantage she lacked and none of her discipline. It was not flattery, she understood that even then. It was too plainly stated, too without ornament to be flattery, and it settled into her chest with a warmth she did not examine too closely. In turn, in the smallest of fragments, he began to let something of himself show, not his name, not his history, but the shape of a man who had once commanded others and had lost, somewhere along some hard road, his faith that command was worth anything at all. A man who watched her manage her small, failing farm with a competence he seemed almost hungry to witness, as though her steadiness were proof of something he badly needed proof of. Once, mending a bridle by lamplight, she caught him watching her instead of the leather in his hands, and something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the merest suggestion of one. Gone again before she could be certain she had seen it at all. And she found herself thinking of that almost smile for days afterward, turning it over the way she turned over a coin found in the road, small and bright, and entirely unexplained. The work of the farm, meanwhile, took on a lightness she had not felt in years. The leaning fence post finally set true, the harness room reorganized with a soldier's tidy efficiency, the old cob's coat brushed to a shine it had not worn since her mother's time. And though Wren told herself repeatedly that this was only the ordinary relief of shared labor, she began to notice, with a kind of rueful private amusement, how often her eyes went to the loft ladder before she had any actual reason to climb it. How often she found some small pretext, a question about the weather, a scrap of news from the village, to prolong the hour they spent together after her father had gone to bed. Once, bringing up a plate later than usual, she found him already asleep, sitting upright against the loft wall, exhaustion having finally overtaken even his careful discipline. And she stood a long moment in the lamplight, simply watching him breathe, easy and even now, where once it had rattled and caught, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, with a small internal jolt of alarm, as tenderness, plain and unguarded and entirely unbidden, the very last feeling she had expected to find waiting for her in a hayloft in the dead of an Ashfield winter. It happened on a night in early February, when a hard frost had silvered every blade of grass in the yard, and the two of them sat together in the loft with a single lamp between them, that Thorn told her, of his own accord and without her asking, what he had spent nearly 2 months refusing to say. She had brought up, carelessly, the matter of the stone monument at the crossroads, the soldier with his sword reversed, remarking only that it seemed a strange thing to build so grand a marker for a man barely cold in his grave, and she felt, rather than saw, the whole of him go rigid beside her, the stillness in his hands turning suddenly to something harder, something braced. We'll pause here only a moment, and if you don't want to miss where this story goes, please do subscribe to the channel before we continue. He was silent so long she thought she had given some offense without meaning to, and then he said, in a voice gone low and strange, that he knew the monument well, that he had stood before it himself not 3 weeks past in the dark, and read his own name carved into the stone. And Wren, who had thought herself long past being startled by anything this quiet, careful man might say, felt the lamplit loft tilt very slightly around her. He told it to her plainly then, the way she had told him of her mother, without ornament, because it seemed the only way either of them knew how to hand over a true thing. That he was Julian Voss, Duke of Ravensmoor, reported dead at Vittoria in a confusion of smoke and cavalry, and a face too ruined by a sabre cut to be certainly his own. Identified, in the chaos of the field hospital, by a signet ring taken from a dying man beside him, and by the desperate, grief-blind word of an aide too eager to close the matter and go home, and buried, with full honours and a monument the size of a small chapel, while he himself had lain 3 months in a Spanish farmhouse, relearning how to walk, too fevered at first to correct the error, and then, as the fever cleared and the truth of his situation clarified itself, too wary to correct it at all, because word had reached him, even in that remote corner of Spain, of how quickly his cousin Edmund had moved to claim the succession, how thoroughly and how comfortably Edmund had settled into a dead man's house, and Julian, weak and friendless, and a very long way from home, had understood with a soldier's cold clarity, but a man who returns from the grave to reclaim what has already been divided among the living is rarely welcomed, and is sometimes simply made to disappear a second time, more permanently. He had made his way home, slowly, careful, penniless, trusting no one, and had been set upon by footpads not 2 miles from his own front gate. In a final, grim irony, he related almost without bitterness, and had crawled the last of the distance not toward the hall, which he no longer trusted, but toward the only shelter he could find, which had turned out to be her stable. Wren sat with all of this a long moment, the lamp guttering low, and found that her first feeling, beneath the shock, was not fear, though fear would have been reasonable enough, but something closer to grief on his behalf. The particular grief of understanding what it must be to stand before your own grave and read your own name and have no one in the world to tell. She did not cry. She had long ago trained herself out of easy tears, and she did not indulge them now. But she reached across the small space between them and took his hand, which had gone cold and still in his lap, and held it, and said only that it seemed to her a very great loneliness, to be mourned so publicly and so wrongly. And Thorn, or Julian, turned his hand in hers so that their fingers laced together, and said, in a voice rough with something he did not name, that it was the first true kindness anyone had offered him since the field hospital, and that he did not entirely know what to do with it. From that night, the shape of their arrangement changed, without either of them remarking on the change aloud. They had been, until then, 2 practical people, managing a strange necessity, And they became, somewhere in the passing of that single confession, something closer to allies, bound by a shared and dangerous secret. Their conversations no longer sideways over harness and mash, but direct, low-voiced, urgent, with the question neither could yet answer, which was what a man could possibly do to reclaim a life that had already been so thoroughly, so publicly, so profitably buried. Julian spoke, in the nights that followed, of the war itself in a way he had not before, of the friends he had lost at Vittoria, of the particular guilt of a man who had lived when so many better soldiers had not. And Wren listened to all of it with the same steady attention she gave to everything, neither flinching from the grimness of it, nor rushing to soften it with easy comfort. And she found that this, more than anything, seems to unknot something long clenched in him, the simple fact of being heard without being managed. She told him, in turn, of her own quiet griefs, of watching her mother fade over a slow, terrible autumn, of her father's hands closing by degrees around a strength he could no longer summon. And there grew between them, in those cold February nights, a kind of ledger of sorrow honestly kept, each confession weighed and received without flinching, until it seemed to Wren that she had told this careful, guarded man more of her true self in a fortnight of lamplit nights than she had told the whole of Ashfield in 22 years, and that he, in turn, entrusted to her a self so private even his own household had never been permitted to glimpse it, a self that was not a duke at all, only a tired, grieving man relearning, slowly, what it felt like to be simply known. It was a strange alliance, forged over lamplight and confession, rather than courtship in any form the district would have recognized. And yet, Wren thought, turning it over in the quiet, after he had gone still and thoughtful beside her, that it was perhaps the only kind of alliance either of them had ever truly wanted, one built on plain seeing rather than on rank, on the steady, unglamorous work of two tired people choosing, night after night, to tell each other the truth. Trouble, once it had found the door, did not wait long to make itself thoroughly at home. It began small, as these things do, with a comment dropped at the village well by one of the hall's upper servants, who mentioned, idly, that Lady Cressida Farrow had taken a particular and pointed interest in the doings of Thistle Cross, and that Mr. Voss had been seen riding past the farm at hours that had nothing to do with rents. Wren felt the first cold thread of dread at this news, but told herself it was only gossip, the ordinary currency of a small village with too little else to occupy it, until the day Lady Cressida herself appeared at the farm gate in a carriage entirely too fine for the muddy lane, ostensibly to inquire after tenant conditions on behalf of her intended, and remained standing at the gate rather longer than any such inquiry required, her sharp, dark eyes moving over the stable with an attention that made Wren's stomach turn to ice. She said little of substance, only a few pointed remarks about how very devoted Wren seemed to her father's smallholding, how very often she must be out among the outbuildings at odd hours, how very interesting it was that a girl with so little to recommend her should suddenly seem so occupied. And then she smiled, a smile with nothing warm in it at all, and returned to her carriage. And Wren stood at the gate long after the wheels had faded down the lane, understanding with a sick certainty that she had been seen, or nearly seen, or suspected of something, though she could not yet tell how much. The slander, when it came at the assembly held at the village hall for the blessing of the New Year's crops, an event Wren had not planned to attend at all, until her father, in one of his rare, lucid insistences, told her she owed herself an evening among people her own age, and would not hear otherwise. She went, in her grey wool, and stood at the edge of the room as she always had, and it was there that Lady Cressida found her, surrounded by a small circle of the district's better families, and remarked, in a voice pitched precisely to Carrie, that she wondered whether Miss Ashcombe's stable accounts might bear closer inspection, given how very frequently feed and linen seemed to disappear from Thistle Cross of late, and whether a girl so pressed for rent might not have found some improper means of supplementing her income, some gentleman caller, kept discreetly out of sight perhaps, in exchange for whatever comforts a poor tenant girl might have to offer a man of means. The room went very quiet. And then, worse than quiet, it began to murmur. Heads turning toward Wren with the particular hungry attention a small community reserves for the ruin of one of its own. And Wren felt the old grey cloak of her invisibility, the cloak she had worn so long and so comfortably, torn suddenly and violently away, leaving her exposed in a manner she had never once, in all her years of being overlooked, thought to prepare herself against. She did not cry. She stood very straight, though her hands had gone cold as the frost outside, and she said, in a voice that shook only slightly, that she did not know what Lady Cressida meant to imply, but that her accounts were her own affair and open to any honest inspection the steward cared to make. And she left the hall with her head level, though her face burned the whole walk home. And it was only in the privacy of the stable, with Julian's arms coming around her before she had even finished telling him what had happened, that she allowed herself, finally, the release of a single, furious, humiliated tear, which she dashed away almost before it fell, as though even now she could not quite permit herself the indulgence. Julian's face, when she had finished, had gone to a stillness far more dangerous than any anger she had yet seen in him. The stillness of a man doing sums of vengeance in his head. And he told her, low and certain, that this would not stand. That Cressida Farrow and Edmund Voss between them had mistaken a quiet woman for an easy target, and that they would learn, sooner than they wished, precisely how mistaken they had been. Though even as he said it, Wren could see the cost calculating itself behind his eyes. The terrible arithmetic of a man who knew that defending her properly meant revealing himself, and that revealing himself meant walking, unarmed and unproven, directly into the danger he had spent 2 months hiding from. He said little more that night, only held her while the last of her composure spent itself against his shoulder. But Wren, lying awake long afterward in the farmhouse while her father slept beside the banked fire, understood, without needing to be told, that something in Julian had shifted decisively in the hour since she had come to him weeping at the gate. But whatever careful calculation of survival had kept him hidden through the long, dark heart of winter, had been outweighed, finally and completely, by the sight of the one person who had asked him no questions and demanded no proof, standing humiliated before a room that would have let her drown in it without a second thought. She thought, too, of Lady Cressida's smile at the farm gate, so certain of its own cruelty, and of Edmund Voss's cold, assessing eyes across the steward's desk. And she found that whatever fear she had felt at the assembly hall had, by morning, hardened into something steadier and considerably less forgiving, a resolve she recognized, with some private surprise, as being entirely her own, and not merely borrowed from the soldier sleeping above the stable. The occasion, Julian chose, was the one Edmund himself had arranged, a grand evening at Ravensmoor Hall, to mark both the formal announcement of Edmund's engagement to Lady Cressida Farrow and the unveiling of a smaller companion monument to be placed inside the hall itself, a marble bust of the late Duke, intended, Edmund had let it be known, to remind the district of the sacrifice upon which the family's continued dignity rested. Though Wren understood by now, as perhaps half the district secretly did, that the sacrifice in question had proved considerably more convenient to the living than to the dead. The hall on the appointed night was lit from every window. Carriages lined the drive, and Wren stood among the tenant families invited to observe from the margins of the great hall, her grey cloak the plainest thread in a room woven through with silk and candlelight. And she found she did not mind the contrast half so much as she once might have, because she knew what was coming, and the room did not. And there is a particular steadiness available to a person who, alone among a crowd, understands the shape of the next quarter hour. Edmund Voss stood before the assembled company near the draped bust, resplendent and composed, Lady Cressida glittering at his side. And he had begun his speech, some polished sentiment about honouring the fallen and securing the future, when the great doors at the far end of the hall opened without ceremony, and a man walked in whom no one in that glittering room had expected ever to see cross a threshold again. He was thinner than the marble bust suggested, and marked by scars the sculptor had never been given to carve. But there was no mistaking, once the shock passed, the bearing of him, the particular set of the shoulders, the pale grey eyes that swept the room once, found Edmund, and did not waver. And a silence fell over the hall so total that Wren could hear the candles guttering. Julian Voss crossed the floor of his own house at a measured, unhurried pace, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the room, without need of raising it. The voice, Wren thought, of a man who had commanded troops under fire and had not lost the habit. He addressed himself first to the assembled company, informing them with cold precision of the confusion at Vittoria, the misidentified body, the long, slow convalescence in Spain, and the footpads who had very merely finished what the war had failed to. And he let that last detail sit in the silence a long moment, before turning, for the first time, to his cousin, and asking him, in a voice gone suddenly, dangerously quiet, whether he had any notion who might have profited from a returning duke never reaching his own front door. Edmund's composure cracked then, visibly, colour draining and returning in blotches, and he began some stammering protest of ignorance and outrage. But Julian was not finished. He turned next, deliberately, to Lady Cressida, and to the room at large, and addressed the matter of a slander recently spoken against a tenant of this estate, a Miss Wren Ashcombe of Thistle Cross, whom certain persons in this very hall had seen fit to accuse of impropriety for the crime of nursing, in secret and at considerable personal risk, a wounded and nameless soldier through a fever that would otherwise have killed him. He said her name into that silence, the way one lays a stone into a foundation, deliberately, permanently. And he told the room, in a voice that shook now with something he no longer troubled to control, that the soldier in question had been himself, that he owed his life without qualification to a woman this room had chosen to shame rather than to thank, and that he would consider it a very particular insult to himself and to the crown he would shortly resume, if anyone present continued to repeat a word of the falsehood spoken against her. He crossed the room then, in full view of everyone who mattered in the district, and took Wren's hand, her chapped, capable hand in her mother's grey cloak, and held it before the assembled company, with the unmistakable deliberate care of a man declaring an allegiance he did not intend to have questioned. And the room that had been so ready only minutes before to feast on her ruin found itself instead rearranging its entire understanding of who exactly had been beneath its notice all along. The magistrate summoned that same week found the matter of the footpad's true employer resolved with a speed that surprised even Julian, one of the men, faced with the certain knowledge of the noose, proving considerably more willing to name his patron than to protect him. And the tale that emerged, of coin paid quietly through an intermediary to ensure a returning heir never completed his journey home, was ugly enough that even those families in the district most inclined to overlook Edmund Voss's ambitions found they could no longer, in conscience or in company, be seen to defend him. Lady Cressida, for her part, discovered the engagement she had worn so proudly only weeks before dissolved before the week was out, her own father arriving from the county seat within days to remove her from a scandal he had no wish attached to his own name, and she left Ravensmoor in a carriage considerably less triumphant than the one in which she had arrived at the farm gate, without so much as a glance toward the tenant girl she had once tried so thoroughly to ruin. Wren, watching this quiet unravelling from the margins where she had always stood, felt no great satisfaction in it, only a kind of tired relief, the relief of a storm finally passing, rather than a battle finally won. And it was this same tiredness, more than triumph, that she carried home that night, her hand still faintly warm where Julian had held it before the whole assembled district. The weeks that followed the unveiling passed in a blur of necessary business that Wren, watching from the edge of it, understood only in fragments. Magistrates summoned from the county seat, the footpads who had attacked Julian on the road traced back, after careful inquiry, to men in Edmund's pay. Lady Cressida's father, moving with unseemly haste to distance his family from the scandal before it could attach itself permanently to his name. And Edmund himself, stripped of the title he had worn so briefly and so comfortably, departing Ravensmoor under a cloud so thorough that even those who had once courted his favour now professed never to have thought much of him at all. Through all of it, Julian moved with the same controlled, unhurried authority he had shown on the night of the unveiling, a man reclaiming, piece by careful piece, the life that had been taken from him. And though the business of it kept him often at the hall and away from the stable where they had first learned each other's silences, he came to Thistle Cross himself, on the first quiet evening the reckoning allowed him, rather than sending for her, because he told her, plainly, that he had decided some things ought to be done properly, and this was among them. He found her in the stable yard in the last grey light of evening, her grey cloak drawn close against the cold, mucking out the very stall in which she had first found him dying, and he stood in the doorway, a long moment, simply watching her work. And Wren, feeling his eyes on her, straightened and turned. And something in his face, some carefully held stillness, finally, visibly letting go, undid the last of her composure, more thoroughly than the whole glittering spectacle of the hall had managed. He told her, there in the yard, with none of the polish he had used before the assembled district, that he had spent 2 months in her stable, believing himself a man with nothing left to offer anyone, not rank, not fortune, not even a name he could safely speak aloud, and that in all that time it had never once been his rank or his fortune or his name that she had tended, but only him, plainly, without calculation, the way she tended everything she judged worth the trouble of care, and that he had come to understand, somewhere in the long, dark weeks of the thaw, that this was the only kind of regard he had ever truly wanted, and had never once, in all his life before the war, been offered. He said he had not chosen her for her birth, because she had none that the world would count, and he had not chosen her for what she could bring to a ducal house, because she could bring nothing the ledgers would recognize. And he had not chosen her because it was convenient, or expected, or wise, because it was none of those things, and he knew it. He had chosen her, he said, his voice roughening on the words, for the plain, unglamorous fact that she had seen a dying stranger in a doorway, and had knelt in the straw, without asking first what he was worth, and that no one, in all his 26 years, had ever seen him so completely, and asked so little in return. Wren, who did not cry easily, and had trained herself long ago against the indulgence, found the tears coming anyway, quiet and unstoppable, and she did not try to dash them away this time, because there seemed, finally, nothing shameful left in being seen exactly as she was. He said her name then, her given name, Wren, not Miss Ashkin, not the tenant girl, but Wren, as though the word itself were a kind of vow, and she said his in turn, Julian, testing the shape of it in a stable gone quiet and golden with the last of the light. And when he kissed her, it was without haste, without the counted urgency of their earlier stolen exchanges, a kiss that felt less like beginning than like arrival. And somewhere in the stalls, the old cob shifted and settled, as though even the horses understood, but whatever had entered that stable in the sleet 3 months before had, at long last, come fully and permanently home. They were married that spring, quietly, at Wren's own insistence, in the small stone church at Ashfield, rather than the grander chapel at the county seat that Julian's restored standing might have commanded. And if the district found it a strange choice for a duke to be wed in so plain a setting, none said so aloud, having learned by then, through the long, strange winter's telling and retelling, precisely what manner of woman they were dealing with, and precisely how little she cared for grandeur that did not serve some honest purpose. Wren's father, seated in a chair carried specially to the front pew for the occasion, wept without shame through the whole of the short ceremony. And Wren, standing before the altar in a gown of soft grey that had been, at her own particular request, dyed the exact shade of her mother's old cloak, rather than the white convention demanded, found she did not mind his tears in the least, understanding them, as she understood so much now, as the particular gladness of a man who had feared, for longer than he had ever let her see, that his daughter's whole life would be spent unnoticed and unclaimed, and who had lived, against every quiet expectation, to see her finally and fully seen. 1 year later, on a morning in December when the frost had again silvered every blade of grass along the millpond field, the stable at Thistle Cross stood exactly where it had always stood, though the east wall no longer leaned, and the roof had been reset with new slate, and the whole low building had about it the particular contentment of a place no longer neglected. Wren Ashcombe, who was now Wren Voss, Duchess of Ravensmoor, still came down to it most mornings, in a cloak that was new and warm, but dyed, at her own insistence, the same plain, undyed grey as the one that had belonged to her mother, because she had found, once the world's eyes were finally, properly upon her, that she did not wish to be seen in any colour but her own. She still marked out the stall in the corner, the one nearest the east door, not because any servant would have refused the task, but because she had asked, and been granted, the particular privilege of keeping this one small labour for herself, a private ritual neither she nor Julian ever felt the need to explain to anyone. Ravensmoor Hall itself had changed almost beyond recognition in the year since the reckoning, not through any grand renovation, but through 100 small acts of unshuttering. The vast dining table that had once seated 30 in state and cold silence had been replaced with one a quarter its size, chosen so that a family might actually speak across it without raising their voices. The West Wing, dark for 3 years before Julian's return, now held a library, restored room by room, its shelves filling slowly with books neither of them had time yet to read, but both intended to. And the walled garden behind the kitchens, given over to bramble and neglect under the old regime, had been turned over and planted, its first modest rows of green already pushing through the thawing soil, though the season had scarcely permitted it. A small, stubborn assertion that the house, too, intended to come fully alive. Her father, whose joints had never fully recovered, but whose spirits had improved considerably once the worry of rent and ruin had been lifted from him entirely, kept a chair by the great hall fire that had become, by unspoken agreement, entirely his own, and spent his afternoons there content, in a way Wren had not seen since her mother's death, watching his daughter come and go from a house he had once been told to fear. Of Edmund Voss and Lady Cressida Farrow, little more was heard in the district, beyond the occasional unkind rumour from more fashionable circles, where they were said to have made, between them, a marriage of mutual convenience and mutual disappointment. And Wren found she thought of them rarely, and without much heat, having concluded somewhere in the year's turning that a life well and honestly lived required very little accounting of theirs. Julian himself, watching from the stable doorway on that December morning, as his wife bent to her work with the same unhurried competence that had first undone him, thought sometimes of the marble monument still standing at the crossroads, the soldier with his sword reversed and his head bowed, and had decided, rather than have it removed, to let it remain exactly as it was, a stone marking not a death, after all, but a beginning, the place where a man buried too soon by everyone who thought they knew him, had first been properly, unglamorously, and entirely seen, by someone who had asked, before anything else, only whether he was still breathing. He crossed the yard now and stood in the stall doorway, and Wren looked up at him, straw dust caught in her hair, and something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile at first, and then, unmistakably, fully, a smile. The whole of it this time, no longer the merest suggestion, but the thing itself. And she smiled back at him, without any of the old, careful restraint, because there was, at long last, nothing left in either of them that needed guarding. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to its end. If it moved you even a little, we would love to hear from you. So please, tell us in the comments which town or city you are listening from tonight, and what this story made you feel. Before he had come to the stall doorway that morning, Julian had walked, as he sometimes still did in quiet hours, down to the crossroads to stand before the old monument alone, and he had thought, as he often thought there, of the strange mercy of his own mistaken burial, of how a misidentified body and a saber-scarred face and 3 cold months in a Spanish farmhouse had, between them, stripped him of every trapping by which the world had once measured him, and left him nothing at all to offer a living soul but the plain, unadorned fact of himself. And how it was precisely that stripped and friendless self, and no other, that a quiet woman in a grey cloak had kneeled beside in the straw and judged, without needing a single fact of his history, worth the saving. He had come home from the war, a dead man, twice over. Once in the ledgers of the field hospital, and once again, more truly, in his own private estimation of his worth. And it had taken a tenant farm's leaning stable, and a woman who mucked stalls before first light, to teach him that a life could be built again from nothing but honest labour and honest care. That a transaction struck in desperation over a stranger's fever could become, by slow and unhurried degrees, not a bargain at all in the end, but simply a life, the truest one he had ever lived. And if you don't want to miss the next one, please do subscribe to the channel so that we may find each other again.